Welcome to the MSL 411, a podcast designed to equip both aspiring and experienced MSLs with the resources they need to level up their career toolkit. The heart of this podcast is to take the same industry knowledge and advice that we share with our own candidates and make it available and accessible to anyone looking for answers. So if you have questions, you've come to the right place. We're here to give you the 411. And without further ado, let's dive right in. Welcome back to the MSL 411 podcast. I'm your host, Linda Eskew, and if you've been following along, you know that we've been taking a few episodes to highlight some of the real people and ideas and experiences that make up the world of medical affairs. And today we're very excited to dive into a story that very beautifully blends science, empathy, and purpose. So we have a special guest here today to talk about all of those things, and that is Christian Hommes. Christian, hi.
Yeah, hey, Linda. Thanks so much for having me on, and just excited to share my story.
And for those of you who don't know Christian, he is a physician assistant turned patient diagnosis liaison whose professional and personal lives really intersect in that rare disease space. And after more than a decade in clinical practice, Christian's path took a turn when his son Silas was diagnosed with Angelman syndrome, which is a rare genetic condition, and that opened a new chapter in his career and I would say in your calling as well, right, Christian?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, before you go through something like that, you're kind of just trying to make things happen in your career. And then it just totally changed what my passion was and where I wanted to go. So, yeah, definitely.
Well, what started as Christian's family search for answers became what I like to think of as a ripple effect, kind of extending from his care from the bedside to his own home, and then, of course, to the broader rare disease community around the world. So today I want to talk a little bit about how that journey unfolded, and then what the patient diagnosis liaison role really looks like, and then how your personal experience can deepen the meaning of your work in medical affairs. And so, again, Christian, I'm so glad you're here. I think there's going to be a lot that you'll be able to shed light on in these topics. But before we dive into your story, I do always like to start off with a few fun questions just to kind of help our listeners get to know you as a real person and get to know you beyond the title on your LinkedIn profile. So couple of icebreakers. What is something that you are surprisingly good at that has nothing to do with medicine or science?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm average at a decent amount of things, but then truly good at the thing that jumps to mind is power napping. So I have developed a really important skill because I have 3 kids. So if I have 5 minutes, I am able to just do a quick power nap and be somewhat recharged. Might be a superpower, might be narcolepsy, whatever you want to call it. But I think that is something I am becoming even better at as I get older. So that's my skill.
That is a superpower. I have a small kid as well, and thankfully he likes to nap for a really long time because I do as well. There's no such thing as a short nap in our house, so I wish I had that skill. Well, then another question for you. Is there a movie or maybe even a TV show that you find yourself quoting way too often?
Yeah, that's another good one. I mean, I don't know if I have a specific quote, but I'm constantly tying things back into shows or episodes I've liked from like The Office or Parks and Recreation are some of my favorites. It's kind of, remember that episode that's like this situation. But yeah, I love those. And, as you travel a lot in medical affairs, the same shows tend to be on TV when you're at the hotels, and The Office is one that is always on. So that's probably it.
There's so many good ones from that. My husband and I binged that one several times. You mentioned travel as part of your role, but maybe on your personal travel bucket list, what place have you not been yet?
Yeah, a lot of spots in Europe specifically, but I've always wanted to go to like Scandinavia and Norway since I was a kid. Don't know exactly why. I mean, it looks beautiful there, but hopefully someday soon we'll get over there.
Yeah. Keep us posted. That sounds like a great trip.
Yeah.
Well, let's move into a little bit of your professional background. So you have spent years as a PA, and tell us about that background and then how you discovered medical affairs.
Yeah, so everybody in medical affairs, I feel like has a really interesting story how they got there. And I had never heard of it before. I started, first of all, born and raised in central Massachusetts, ended up going to physician assistant school in Boston and met my wife there, who's also a PA. We moved to Chicago and started working in emergency medicine. Which I really liked, and did that for years. ended up coming to Nashville, where I live now, again to work in emergency medicines. I've spent about 14 years total working in the ER, either full time or part time. And really had no idea, if somebody mentioned pharma or industry, I would have just thought sales. And I wasn't really too interested in doing that. I just don't think I'm a good salesperson. But like you kind of mentioned, so my life changed dramatically when my son was diagnosed with Angelman syndrome. And I really felt this calling that I wanted to work in genetics or rare disease and just didn't know how to transition into that. Clinically, there weren't any positions down where I lived. And I was just feeling a little bit lost and honestly wanted to get out of the ER as well. So it took definitely talking to a lot of people, realizing that there's this whole side of industry that is not necessarily sales or marketing or whatever, but just talking science with providers or clinics, and that was something I was already doing in the ER. So that's kind of how I just started talking to people that were in those roles and realized that that sounded amazing. And an industry, rare disease is a really important topic right now, and a lot of companies are diving in there. So I thought it was just a really good fit.
So, a lot of people, and you and I talked about this a little bit before recording this episode, but a lot of people who are looking at roles in medical affairs, maybe you're not as familiar with the patient diagnosis liaison role. So I'm very interested to get into that with you. But tell us about your first patient diagnosis liaison role and what that process of transitioning into that role looked like.
Yeah, so, when I started to learn more about industry and medical affairs, I really didn't know specifically what I could get into. So I had a couple of things to overcome. One is that I was a physician assistant, not a PharmD, which a lot of MSLs typically have. I mean, I had no experience. So what I started to really do is go on LinkedIn, which I had never been on clinically before, just network with people, basically found any physician assistant in industry that I could find and started to kind of chat with them. Um, and then also followed companies that I knew of that worked in the rare disease space. And then I was able to connect with a colleague on my team that eventually I was hired for. And we talked, and he told me about his role. And then eventually, a few months later, they had an opening. So it really kind of started with the networking, researching. And then because of that connection, I was able to get an interview.
I love that. And we talk about networking so much on our podcast. And I think you just described an absolute perfect case study in networking. Maybe that you weren't as familiar with LinkedIn or using it for what you use it for now, but how you got on there and were very strategic with who you chose to connect with, and then furthering those conversations, building those relationships, and then seeing where that led down the line. So for all of our listeners, that's how it's done. So I think that was a perfect example of how you successfully network using LinkedIn. But I want to talk a little bit about your role itself, because again, some of our listeners may not be as familiar, or some may, but they don't really know all the ins and outs. But what exactly does a patient diagnosis liaison do, and how does that differ from a traditional MSL position?
Yeah, so I was hired as a patient diagnosis liaison, and I'll just say up front, if you search for that on LinkedIn or try to find that position, you may not find it. There's a lot of jobs and roles in medical affairs that are very hybrid, and they have different names for each company. So maybe it would be like a clinical trial liaison, or a lot of things we do are similar to a medical science liaison. But it's essentially what I would do primarily is try to drive an increased trial recruitment for whatever program I was working on. Um, and clinical trials, you want to get them completed quickly, not only for the company but for the community and the patients, because the sooner you get that trial recruited and going, possibly the sooner that drug is on the market. That was primarily what my role was. So every company may have kind of a different position that works in there, but that was for the most part what I did. And then it started to change, and wore many hats during the years I was doing that.
So, what does a typical day look like for you in this role, or for anyone in this type of field-based medical affairs role?
Yeah, so typical day, depending on what program you're working on, what, in this case, a clinical trial, you generally have kind of a list of target clinics or doctors or providers that treat the patients that your drug is treating. And so you're reaching out to them, trying to set up a meeting, trying to see if they have any questions. And basically, we were trying to share the information on the clinical trial. And the idea was that you want the clinics and the doctors to know about it. So if the patient comes to them, they know how the drug works, what are the inclusion, exclusion criteria, all of that stuff. So a lot of it's kind of, I guess, kind of cold calling, but some of these are relationships that have already been established. So, and then when you're able to get that meeting scheduled, then either you're traveling in person or virtually, meeting with these clinicians, talking pretty high level science about how the drug works, eventually sharing data, kind of depending on what the role is, but having good quality meetings with these providers, and then eventually taking what you learn and bringing it back to your team to see how you can help the knowledge process for the company.
I imagine coming from that world, the PA world, working with healthcare providers so closely that being able to talk that talk is probably super helpful in building those relationships when it's not already an established relationship that you have, but when you're trying to go out and get those new contacts. But are there any other unique skills from your clinical background that you found super valuable as you made that transition into this new role?
Yeah, you're totally right. I think that the way you can identify as a formerly treating clinician with the doctors or, HCPs you're talking to, you kind of know what they're going through. You can talk the tests and results with them, how the patients, present, referral patterns. You kind of know all that already. So it was really helpful for me to just kind of jump in like that. And then I think that a lot of clinicians, it's easier to have a specialty you worked in and then transition into that specialty and industry. For me, I was coming from emergency medicine, and I think I really had to prove to a hiring manager that the skills of seeing all diagnoses, talking to all patients and specialties was really a benefit for me because I would talk to a cardiologist and then a neurologist, and I just had to
Mm.
rapidly kind of identify how to relate to those people I was talking to. And that I think really helped when you're especially jumping disease states. You want to be able to know what those specialists want to hear. So I think all those skills really played in and it made it easier for me to interact with those people.
Yeah, your specific background, like you said, you probably had a unique ability to tailor your message from dealing with all those different types of doctors and types of specialists. So, very interesting. I appreciate hearing how that was seen as a positive by the hiring manager when you were hired for that first role, because sometimes they don't see that, and sometimes we as recruiters have to kind of help them see that, like, look, this is how this is going to help your team. And so it's really great that you were able to demonstrate that and convey that. Well, I want to move on to talking about, of course, how your personal experiences have shaped how you approach your work. And you talked a little bit about your son, Silas, and his diagnosis. Of course, you are kind of in that caregiver role as a parent of a child with a rare disease, but how has that shaped the way that you approach your work?
Yeah, I think that how it's really shaped it is it helps you to have that passion for what you're doing, which I think most people don't have to force or look too hard to get that since it's an interesting field. But to really know that what you're doing can affect and help families and patients, and specifically, I'm working in rare disease, so um, it very closely mirrors what I'm going through. But every day doesn't feel like work. It's me trying to impact the lives of those families.
Mhm. And you mentioned in an earlier conversation when we were talking a while back about this episode and this subject that we were going to be talking about, you mentioned to me that authenticity and personal passion can sometimes really resonate with employers or future employers. Can you expand on that idea a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that, if you can tie in your personal experience or your story when you're talking with a hiring manager or the company, it really makes you stand out because it's something that, you're going to maybe not work harder, but you're going to be more invested in the product you're working with, or you're going to tie in that personal experience. So it doesn't have to be something very rare like a rare disease, but if you're interviewing with a cardiology job and you've had direct experience with family members that have had struggles trying to find the right medication or treatment. All of those things you can bring up just makes you I think more genuine and probably more marketable to those companies.
And I think we see that on the recruiting end, not 100% of the time, but often, especially when you're looking at companies that work in, Alzheimer's or even sickle cell disease, things like that, where maybe the MSL doesn't have personal experience with that themselves personally, but they have a parent or a grandparent or a sibling or friend that dealt with that. And so it's just kind of their passion. Maybe they've never worked in that space before. They worked in other areas in neurology, not necessarily Alzheimer's, but they're able to convey that connection. And it does bring a whole new level of passion in that disease state. And I agree with you completely on that. I think it speaks to the employers. You're just going to be more dedicated to the cause. That's such an interesting thing. Do you think that medical affairs as a whole is evolving to place more value on professionals and MSLs, people in medical affairs who have that lived experience? Are they starting to kind of pivot more to valuing that, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. You may see it more than I do. I mean, I think it's hopefully moving in that direction. I think that really, scientific experience is still probably valued more because you really need to be able to talk high level chemistry, biology in these disease states. And even if you had the experience as a caregiver or family member, if you can't translate that discussion scientifically, you probably won't be able to do too well there. But I think if you're able to have both, even the specific clinical experience taking the place of maybe that high level scientific experience, I do think it's moving in that direction that clinical experiences seems to be valued more highly than it was maybe a few years ago.
And you briefly touched on this, but what advice would you give to someone who's maybe looking to jump into a therapeutic space that is more personal to them? Maybe they haven't worked necessarily directly in that space, or they're very interested in getting into that space because of their personal connection. How would you advise those people who want to connect their personal story to their professional purpose?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways you could do it. I mean, the probably the most drastic way is that if you're a clinician and let's say you are really interested in going into oncology industry positions, then you could try to get a clinical job in oncology. Um, just trying to find any clinical experience, I think, in that specific disease state is helpful. Kind of what I did is that our family was becoming involved in the advocacy groups with Angelman. And so I tried to find ways to volunteer with them to help on their clinical side, help with education on disease states, anything that could kind of translate into some role like in medical affairs is what I tried to do.
And that's another topic I want to get into, of course. You mentioned the rare disease advocacy in the groups that you're involved in. I would love to dig more into that subject. So tell me a little bit about what that involvement with the Angelman Syndrome Foundation has looked like. And then also, I believe I've read some things about the advocacy that your family has led. So if you want to talk a little bit about those, I'd love to get a better understanding.
Yeah, so Angelman syndrome has a few different advocacy groups, and when we got diagnosed, we kind of just dove right in there. I don't think a lot of families necessarily do that, but we were kind of searching for community and some answers and hope, of course. And so these groups we have are amazing. They're funding research, therapeutics, funding the clinics where the kids get care. And so we really kind of gravitated to that, started attending conferences, scientific symposiums, and just really trying to learn more about the research that was going on. And so that was kind of where it started. And then as I was considering trying to transition or get a different position, I started to help kind of how we look at our clinics with Angelman syndrome. Are they providing the right care for the patients across the country? Are they all having the same standards? Do we have the right education for either clinicians or for families that are newly diagnosed? So just trying to get a little bit more involved in that. And then what our family tried to do is that, as when you get a diagnosis like this, you're trying to figure out kind of some way you can do something, help impact, the community, do something instead of just kind of sitting there and watching it happen. And so we started doing fundraisers probably a couple of years after diagnosis and just really enjoyed being able to share with our friends and family, have them be a part of what we were going through. And so we did organize some pint nights that were a blast. Last year we did like a relay race, a Ragnar relay race. And yeah, just trying to do something that is really spreading awareness, but then also involving friends and family to join you in that mission, which I think they all want to do. They just need the opportunity. So that's kind of our approach.
That's so cool. And I've personally been involved in some fundraisers like that here just for friends who have kids with rare diseases. Like the TSC Foundation has a race that our company participates in every year to support a friend's daughter. And we've done some races for brain cancer research, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so cathartic, I think, probably more so for you who's so directly impacted, but to be able to physically do something, to do something tangible and to get your friends on board, get your family on board, and bring some recognition there. So I read a little bit about some of the cool things that you guys have done, and I just think that's been uh, such a neat thing that you've been able to do for coming alongside the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and doing some things that are a little bit closer to home. Well, I would love to talk a little bit more about how our listeners, if they're wanting to dig in a little bit more on the Angelman Syndrome Foundation or that community and maybe get involved in advocacy there or patient advocacy on a more broad scale, what are some things that you would suggest for listeners who maybe want to get involved in patient advocacy?
Yeah, I mean Angelman specifically, it's pretty rare. It's 1 in 15,000 or so. So it's definitely something you may not have heard of or know anybody that has that. But um, the advocacy groups have really wonderful presences on social media, so you can follow along on their accounts. And there's just a lot of very exciting things happening in industry for Angelman and obviously for other rare diseases as well. I think that if you have a particular connection, or you're a caregiver to a rare disease individual, trying to involve yourself in something like that is really helpful. And then attending events too. So Angelman syndrome, there's walks around the country, lots of different family-led events, but it just gives you kind of an understanding of how the families go through their day-to-day life with this, what kind of needs they have. It just gives you a really firsthand impression of what's going on.
I may put a link in the show notes for anyone who's listening for the National Organization of Rare Disease NORD, their website, because I believe they do have a lot of links to advocacy groups and things like that for pretty much any rare disease listed on their website. So that may be a good starting point as well. I'll make a mental note to put that in the show notes. Well, let's talk a little bit about how the balance between caregiving and your career, what that's looked like for you. So, what strategies do you have that have helped you balance the responsibility of being a caregiver and then also being a medical affairs professional?
Yeah, I think that the one of the many blessings of a medical affairs or a industry job is I'm remote, so I'm able to be home for the most part, and being able to balance that work life schedule is so important because when my wife and I were both working clinically, there were days we were both in the emergency room, and if something happened with our kids, there was a babysitter, and we couldn't get out of there. So it's much more flexible having being able to pick the kids up if I have to, or if there's a sickness or an illness, or you just never know what happens with a kid with Angelman syndrome and when you need to jump in there. So that flexible schedule has been huge for me.
And is there anything that you wish others, listeners out there, maybe even employers, they understood better about what it is to be a professional who is also a caregiver?
I think that there should be, we talked about this a little bit, but there should be some importance placed on people that have these lived experiences as candidates, because I just think that every aspect of your work is going to be, positively affected by that experience. Um, I think that most industry positions, they really value work-life balance. So I think that it's a great field to be in, to be able to kind of manage all these things, and especially knowing that you're a lot of times you're working for patients and families that don't have great options for treatment, and it's easy to identify with families that are going through that as well.
And like you were mentioning when you were back in the days of working in the ER, how difficult it was to kind of balance that professional life with being able to be present for your kids if they're sick or something like that. So just the autonomy that a career in medical affairs offers is a step above what most employers in the professional world are able to give. So just having that autonomy and able to be there for your kids is, I wish more employers out there could offer that or be empathetic towards that. But let's talk about some lessons that we might have here for those folks who are not yet in medical affairs, but maybe looking to get into medical affairs. Maybe they're thinking the MSL role is the only option out there. Now they're discovering this patient diagnosis liaison role, and there's other roles, just great alternative medical affairs roles. What would you say to someone coming from your type of background, clinical or even an advocacy background, who is looking to move into a medical affairs role?
Yeah, so if you're coming from the clinical background, I think medical affairs is really perfect because you're trying to share unbiased scientific information, have that exchange with clinicians. So you don't have to feel like you're trying to pitch something you don't believe in. You're really just trying to educate for the most part. And that's what we do as clinicians all the time. So we already talked about this, but networking with everyone is really the first step. Helps you learn the different positions you might want and the nuances to them. And then really just finding mentors too. So I was able to had some really good friends that steered me in the right direction and then connected me with people that I could talk through the interview processes, through your presentations you have to do for interviews. Especially coming from the clinical realm, it's a totally different process from resume to interview. And so having somebody to throw all those questions at to practice my presentation with was huge. And I mean, I don't think I would have landed any position if it wasn't for those people helping me out.
Mentorship is huge. And
Mm.
I think we have a lot of people who are struggling to get those interviews. They've applied for jobs and they don't hear back. But those who do hear back finally, okay, that's half the battle. Yay. Now I have this interview. What do I do to stand out or to be successful in that interview? Is there anything that you felt like helped you stand out in the interview portion of that transition?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, any interview is great. If you can land an interview, it's great experience. You have to practice presenting. You have to learn to answer these different questions that are thrown at you. And I had interviews that were not in rare disease. So I think the way that I I still tried to, tie that into what I did clinically. I think I had a interview in respiratory, and I don't really know any family members that struggle with respiratory issues, but I saw those patients in the ER, and so I
Mhm.
tried to tie that in. So if you can tie in your clinical experience or personal experience, um, and then eventually working in rare disease or having experience in rare disease, I think that if you're able to just show that you have that passion, from the start, most companies, they want to see that you fit their culture. Most companies' cultures are that you're going to be working tirelessly to benefit the patients, improve their quality of life, maybe give them a treatment that they don't have. And so, if you're able to kind of demonstrate that you fit that company's ethics and what they're looking for, then I think that's huge.
Let's look even a step further than that, the transition. So you've landed the role, you're transitioning, you're onboarding. What are some keys to success in that portion?
Yeah, it's again totally different coming from the clinician side of it. I mean, I think I try to be over prepared for whatever I'm dealing with. So just really trying to understand the disease state and even taking it a step further. So you may not even be able to answer a question related to what you're researching, but at least the background behind everything. So I try to be as prepared as possible in the disease state. And then I think also really understanding the patient side of it. So it's a good reminder to listen to stories from the advocacy teams of what the patients are going through. So it's kind of like a reset. You're working, you're doing sending emails, doing all these things on your computer. You're kind of like, what does this mean in the big picture? And then being able to hear those stories again, remember this is what we're working for. This is what we're trying to do. Help kind of drive, makes you feel like every day you're actually making little steps towards improving a patient's life. in the long
Mhm.
run.
Well, and for you personally, what's been the most rewarding part of this whole medical affairs journey so far? So far.
Yeah, yeah, I think that it really you feel like you are making an impact on those families. It's a little kind of tangential because you're talking to doctors and clinics and not the families, but you're educating those clinics. So you're telling them maybe things they don't know. You're offering uh, hope to that the clinicians can pass on to their families. And then ultimately, if you're working on a drug that gets approved, then you have been a small or a large part in that process. And, maybe in the day to day, it doesn't seem like you're actually making an impact, but then all of a sudden, a major milestone happens, data comes out that looks great, or, a drug gets approved, and then all of a sudden, then you were a part of that. So, yeah, I think that that's been very rewarding, is that it does feel like I am making an impact.
I love that. And then what are your hopes for the future of rare disease, both education and advocacy? Do you have any thoughts about what the future of that ideally would look like?
Yeah, I think that I think that there's becoming more and more really good connections with advocacy and industry and how they are sharing what they're learning. And I hope that that continues because I know working in the field, I learn things that maybe the advocacy groups or families do not know, or met clinicians that were passionate but weren't involved in advocacy. So I'm hoping that those, compliantly can become more tied together so that what medical affairs learns can be used by families and advocacy groups and vice versa. So where that will go, I don't know. I think it's hopefully moving in that direction, but we have a lot that we can help each other with.
Very true. Well, I know we're coming up on the end of our time here, so I want to just ask a couple more quick wrap up questions. But
Sure.
what is one practice or maybe a mindset shift that helps you stay grounded as both caregiver and professional?
Gosh, as caregiver, I think it's just a day by day thing. You have some great days and some lousy days, and it's just trying to take it day by day, seeing the big picture. And I think as a professional, I kind of mentioned this before, but really trying to take a step back and think about who you're actually working for, not just the company, but the patient population and whatever you do to do that, whether it's watch a video or look at a picture of a patient that you're trying to help. Anything like that, I think gets you back to what really matters.
That you've been working in rare disease for a bit, but what is one misconception you've noticed that people have about working in rare disease?
That's a good one. And I don't know if this holds true for everyone. I mean, I think that I initially thought it would be really hard to meet with HCPs and clinicians because it is a rare disease. There's less people that treat them. I found that people, clinicians really want to hear updates. They really want to hear science and talk about it. They're passionate about these programs and these patients. So I don't know if that's a misconception, but that's what I found, is that people were really eager to meet with me and our team, and just because of it's just such an exciting time in rare disease.
And what, as a caregiver and parent of a child with rare disease, what's one piece of advice that you now would give your younger self back when Silas was first diagnosed?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, I believe God has a plan for everything, and you know, after a diagnosis like that, you start grieving and you're like, what, why did this happen to us? And then you start to come out of it and realize that there is a plan and there's a way you can make an impact. And luckily I was able to make an impact with my career, which I didn't know how to do at the time. But yeah, just tracing back those steps, there's a plan, and that's what I would try to encourage myself with back then.
Well, last question here. For those listening who've heard us talk about Silas a little bit, how is Silas? Tell us a little bit about the little guy.
Yeah, he's good. He's 9. He is 4'2" and 75 pounds, so he is becoming a larger dude. So, if you've never heard of Angelman syndrome, one of the hallmarks is that they're almost excessively happy, which is amazing. And so he's like that. He's always happy, rarely sad. He still has issues he needs to figure out, like he needs to learn how to walk. Uh, and do things for himself. But yeah, he's doing really well health wise. And I would just encourage everyone to look up Angelman syndrome and read about all the research and treatments and trials that are going on, because it is really exciting stuff.
That's great. And yes, everyone out there, definitely look into it. It's if you haven't heard of it, I mean, it is rare. So probably there are people out there who haven't heard of it or have heard of it but don't know much about it. It's definitely worth looking into. I think it kind of falls into the, what you were saying about God has a reason for everything. There can be a blessing in every situation. And I think that the perpetual happiness of these kids with Angelman syndrome is, I mean, despite all the other things going on, I think that that's the positive spin on it, is that they're just such joyful kids. And so thank you for sharing that about Silas and what
Yeah,
he's
of
up to
course.
these days and how he's growing. But Christian, this has been such a great conversation. Of course, I enjoyed hearing your story and also just the heart behind what you do. And I think it's a great reminder to all of us that at the end of the day, it's about more than data, more than deliverables. It's about people and connections and purpose. And I think that you're able to bring all of your personal experience into your professional role and really make it more about that. So if you're out there and you're listening to Christian's story and maybe it's making you think differently about what it means to care, whether that's for patients or for families or even yourself, self-care, whoever, we would love to hear from you. Of course, there's a link in the show notes below where you can share your thoughts or your questions or your takeaways. Maybe even share how a personal connection has shaped your work in medical affairs, similar to Christian's. You can also find Christian on LinkedIn, along with links to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, and of course, find some other ways to get involved in rare disease advocacy as well. And again, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you on that path. But thank you so much for joining us, Christian. We've loved having you on the show, and thank you for sharing so much of your personal story.
Yeah, thanks so much, Linda. And again, happy to try to help anybody that's trying to go through the same process I went through. So just reach out, and if I can help, I will.
I appreciate that. And thank you all so much for joining us for this episode of MSL 411, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to share the link, let your friends know, and of course, connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you want more information on today's topic, please feel free to reach out. Be sure to check back soon as we continue to explore the topics that matter most to you in medical affairs.